Hey, good morning or good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. My name is Mike Van Newkirk. I'm Executive Vice President at Ipsos in our automotive practice and also an SAA board member. I want to thank you for joining us today. Hopefully over the next hour, you're going to see some key findings from the Ipsos Global Trends Report. This is an annual report we do. It's a consumer-centric toolkit that we use and that you can use to understand future consumer needs, hopefully to help you better design vehicles and services to meet those needs when that future arrives. You're going to hear about some top trends and forces you should be paying attention to, and hopefully get a sneak peek at how you can use them to become more future facing. Before we get started, I want to, on behalf of the SAA board members and to our membership, want to thank all of you and all of our sponsors for their support, which has allowed us to evolve and provide greater value to our members and to the industry as a whole. Now, sponsorship at the SAA is a very cost-effective way to help provide some unique and targeted ways to reach a variety of decision makers in the auto industry. If you or your organization have some interest, please feel free to contact me or anyone on the SAA board if you'd like to get some additional information. For those of you that are new to SAA, you'll see here our value proposition as it's laid out. And you can see our core value really is on focusing on providing relevant events, access to industry leaders, and hopefully some great networking opportunities. We have a very diverse membership. Our members represent OEMs, suppliers in the industry, data providers, and a litany of different organizations looking for timely, relevant industry information. I'm going to thank you to those of you who have become members or are current members, and we hope that you're finding great value in that. We've got a lot of really great events planned for 2025, and we'll hope like this one, that you'll join us for many of those as well. Speaking of the events, here's a list of some of the near-term ones coming up. You can scan the QR code here also. That'll give you access to our website. Our next event actually after this one is a coffee break. These are 15-minute sessions that provide a high-level view of a timely topic. On March 12th, Plant Moran will be examining the implications of the latest in mergers and acquisitions. And then following that on March 13th is our Young Professionals Network. They're going to be holding a happy hour at Hopcat in Royal Oak. And we'll have a guest speaker from Microsoft who will provide an update on AI and its implications in our industry. Following that on April 8th, we'll be meeting at the American Center for Mobility in Ypsilanti for discussion and demonstration of innovative positioning techniques or technologies and systems architectures that are being enabled for safe autonomy at scale. And make sure you save the following 2 dates. On April 30th, we'll be at the Livonia Marriott for the annual Recall Summit. And then on the 20th of May, we'll be at the annual Automotive OEM Purchasing Summit, which we put on with our partners from Plant Moran and from the MEMA Original Equipment Suppliers. We'll have more great events coming in 2025, so continue to check our website regularly for the latest event info. So during today's webinar, please feel free to submit your questions and we'll get to many of them as we can. We have a Q&A session at the end of the talk where Jennifer and our colleague Graham, who you can see on the screen, are going to be joining us to go through as many of them as we possibly can fit in the time allowed. So at this point, I would now like to turn over the program to Jennifer Bender. Jennifer is the Global Head of Trends for Foresight at Ipsos, and she sets the agenda for trends and future consulting with clients and leads our global trends study. Thank you again for your time, Jennifer.
Thank you very much and appreciate the warm welcome. Very happy to be here with you today. And I think what we're really excited about is to share some of the great insights in our global trends study, as Mike mentioned. So really what this is, I think, is a wonderful tool set for you to use as individuals within your organizations. And really what we'll share with you is a top-line view of the global trends, which are applicable to all markets and certainly provide great inspiration and things that you can take back to your teams in terms of infusing a future view into your business. So when we talk about the global trends, really what we're talking about is the culmination of 10 years worth of this study. So we have been looking at trends, asking consumers for their perspectives, tapping into our own experts and external experts, and really getting a very clear view of what people around the world are thinking, feeling, and doing. That's led by our growth consultancy, the part of the business that I sit in Ipsos Strategy 3. And what that means is that we have the really amazing opportunity to look not just at what has been happening this year, how people are feeling, how people have responded to the survey this year, but to look back in time over the past 10 years worth of studies that we've done on these topics. And this, in fact, is the biggest study and the deepest study that we've ever conducted, with more than 50,000 interviews done around the world in 50 different markets and representing a large portion of the population and the world's GDP. So no small undertaking. But I think the other thing to know is that it's not just an attitudinal survey. Yes, that is the core of what we do, but we also look very broadly and tap into trend and foresight experts around the world, both as part of our core team, as well as many of the markets that we're in Ipsos, and look at change through multiple levels. And I think this is important to understand when you're taking this back to your teams as well, that there are 3 different levels that we think about change. The first is macro forces, and these are the big, undeniable forces, things that are readily observable in the world in terms of how the world is changing around us. And we'll talk a little bit about those in just a minute. The second type of change is shifts, and these are a little bit closer in, things that we see in terms of attitudes changing, behaviors changing, market shifts as well, and potentially category shifts. So it's one click down and a little bit closer in. And then signals are the types of change that we see really every day. New innovations, new messaging, new advertising campaigns, things that we see on social media. All of those are really granular examples of how the world is changing and examples of these broader forces at play in terms of how consumers respond to them. And the other thing to know is that none of these operate in isolation. Each of these types of change, whether they're granular signals of expressions of things happening today, bigger, broader shifts over the next 1 or 2 years, or macro forces that are going to be in effect for 3, 5, even 10 years, all of these have an impact on one another and influence one another. So it's really a network of change that we're looking at from all of these different levels. The result in terms of what's inside the study is 3 different things that are a great toolkit for you to use within your organizations. The first being macro forces, and I'll give a snapshot of what those look like in just a moment. The second being the values and attitudes, in other words, the study data itself, how people responded, how we can cut that data and look at different types of segments, look at different audiences, and really unpack how people are feeling on lots of different topics. And then the third one is where we'll spend most of our time today on the consumer trends. And I think this is always what catches people's attention and drives a lot of conversation. So we're hoping to hear lots of questions from you at the end, and we'll have time at the end to answer those questions. So in terms of the macro context, I mentioned that this is really the big type of change that's happening over the long term, things that are broadly viewable from an external perspective. They're readily available in external data, things like demographic changes, population changes, the way that people's life stages are changing, for example, declining birth rates in certain markets, people having families later, forming households later. But there are lots of other types of change that we look at this macro level as well. For example, technology and its impact on our lives, concerns about data privacy, the impact of technology, potentially negative impact, especially when people are questioning how much we're on screens and how social media is impacting our lives. Economics is certainly a big one in terms of macro forces, not just the current, how people are feeling and how people are reacting to cost of living and inflationary environment, but also the broader themes that we see in terms of economic disparity and even relationships in employers and employees as part of that economic picture. Environment is certainly a big one, and that's always something that we look into as well. Climate change being the biggest factor, but of course other types of factors that we're looking at from an environmental perspective. And then, of course, the big one, topics that are happening overall, but certainly very of the moment right now in terms of political environment. So thinking about how rising types of sentiment and broader themes around politics are happening in every market and between markets. And then, of course, we look at wellness. So this is in addition to the STEEP framework that we think is really helpful in terms of looking at how broader perspectives and things like breakthrough technologies are really changing how people are coming to wellness and coming to their lifestyles in general. So all of these macro forces are ways of thinking about how the world is changing around us. And I would say this is, a snapshot view. There's more detail underneath in the paid portion of the study that's behind a firewall. But even at this high level, this is a really great tool for you to use internally as you're going into strategic planning sessions, as you're thinking about how consumers are behaving. Think of this as almost a placemat that you can really explore and start to think about how people are responding to this macro environment. So the biggest thing that we want to spend time on today is the trends framework itself. And these have evolved over time. So you'll see, if you've seen any of our Ipsos Global Trends in the past, you'll see some commonality in terms of reference to certainly climate, things like globalization, even nostalgia, health, and trust. But all of these have been refreshed in our most recent study that came out at the end of last year, and is certainly something that's going to be in effect for the next couple of years. And these are really fresh views on how trends are evolving and how we think about consumers' behavior in regard to those trends. One of the things that we've pulled out in particular this year is looking at tensions. And you'll start to see this immediately in terms of, for example, our first trend around globalization and how it's fracturing. And this is really something that we've been looking at for a long time that has been growing. The sentiment around globalization and whether it's good or bad has been growing. It's been a big part of the debate and certainly something that's relevant for this industry. But something that is also starting to show up is that there is really an interesting tension between different types of societies, between different types of established and emerging markets, but also between the haves and the have-nots within specific countries. So we expect to see further division along the political ideologies that are driven by technology, where people have a very fundamental disagreement about whether globalization is good for me, good for the economy, good for my country, and all sorts of differing opinions on that topic. So when we think about what's driving globalization and this fractured notion, whether people are looking at it positively or negatively, it's certainly influenced by things like the increasing number of geopolitical conflicts, wars, certainly tariffs is a big part of it today. But it's also driven by a long-term rise in nationalism and populism and how people think about what is important to their own country and to their own community in relation to the global stage. So part of this is also driven by the economic realities of economic divides, the rise and fall of middle classes. In the case of the US, that would be really specifically around the shrinking middle class and the economic divides between higher income and lower income consumers. But we're also seeing a broad shift about globalization being good for my country starting to tick up, which was interesting as we started to look at this from a global perspective. And yet, even when we look down into the US specifically, we start to see a lot of pushback on that. And that starts to come to play, certainly in terms of signals that we're seeing. In fact, recent announcements that have been made in terms of how people are reacting to globalization, how technology companies, for example, are reacting to their role in society as well, and how much of that is really changing on a daily basis. So a lot of this is really tied into local versus global. And not to say that that's, a sentiment that's shared across every category. People may answer very differently about whether they prefer global brands when they're talking about a food item versus a car versus any other type of product or service. The answer about whether they prefer global or local brands may be different. So there's a lot of nuance within this trend as well. And when we think about this from a broader perspective, the biggest tension is really about how improvements in globalization is perceived by the public. We certainly are a globally connected society thanks to technology, thanks to the internet and social media. So that's not really going to change. But one thing that is changing is how the middle class is reacting and how they are looking at globalization, whether that's good for the country. And in fact, what we saw is that less than half of Americans feel that globalization is good for the country, and even fewer than that think that it's good for them personally. So really interesting to look at how that compares across different markets, but also how that potentially looks across different parts of the community as well. For example, we saw that 67% of boomers think that they're very proud of my country, as opposed to a very small amount relative to that, 37% of Gen Z. So when you think about globalization, it certainly is tied into this sense of national pride. It certainly is tied into sentiment around immigration, certainly is tied to global versus local brands. So there's a lot in here to think about. And looking at how these generational differences start to split out is really interesting as well. So when we think about this in terms of implications around, globalized and deglobalized trade, there's certainly this oft-cited remark in this perspective that local automotive brands are less local than international brands just because of manufacturing locations. And this float of trillions of parts from different locations across different country divides and across borders certainly makes it a little bit more confusing. So the question is, what does it mean to be a local automotive brand today? What does that look like to be a global OEM? And where are there opportunities and challenges depending on your consumer's perspectives? The big one that's very top of mind right now, and in fact, when I wrote this a couple of weeks ago, Canada and Mexico was the big debate. Of course, there have been many other tariffs and lots of potential trade conflicts coming about. And that could potentially, have a big impact on automotive manufacturers. I'm sure you're all watching this very closely as well, even on daily updates coming out of the White House. But I think that what's interesting is, how they shake out potentially have a long-term effect on how consumers think about global brands as well. So there are, again, opportunities and challenges within that. And I think therein lies the kind of third takeaway here is there perhaps a balance? Is there potential to look at a preference between global and local and to almost play both sides depending on where your consumers fall? It could be that you need to match shifting consumer preferences and start to play up a global perspective or a local perspective, depending on what your brand really values and what your consumers are looking for. How they appeal to different types of consumers may be very different to that earlier point about generational divides. So really understanding where your consumers are at in terms of preferring global versus local for automotive, and how they feel about that more broadly in the current political landscape. Certainly a tricky question, but one that's worth diving into. The second trend is very related to that, and not just from a global versus local perspective, but this one really hones in on the splintered societies that we all are, I think, are, at least in the US, feeling on a daily basis in terms of the political debate. But this trend is not just about political division. It's about differing opinions and increasing divides on lots of different topics. Yes, political ideology is part of it, but this intensity of this feeling divided has certainly increased over the past decade. And it started to heighten as we see societal stress, social stress coming about, for example, being driven by economic stress as well. So the tension here is that we think that this is going to continue to move forward in terms of tension between the haves and the have-nots, but also that we think the political landscape will be driven by more of the technology perspective. When we think about that specifically, the reason we say that it's being driven by technology is filter bubbles and echo chambers are certainly a big part of it, that we are looking for oftentimes people who think like us, things that feel familiar to us. And that's driven a lot by the access to information that we have and what we seek out online. But it's also driven by how we form communities and how we look for like-mindedness. So part of this is being driven by population change. Certainly that is a moment of debate. But part of it is also driven by some of those bigger factors that we were talking about earlier in terms of wealth disparity. And we see some of this coming through in terms of the attitudinal shifts, in particular, having differences in income and wealth is bad for society has started to tick up in terms of what we're seeing in our survey. So what that means in terms of signals and how this is coming to life is lots of debate about access to financial services, how we handle refugee crises, and how we handle information, how all of that is potentially handled by governments, by organizations, and by individuals. So when we think about what this means from a functional standpoint, we see not only that people are divided across borders, people of different countries feeling differently, but we're also seeing a divide within households. In fact, we heard some stories over the holidays of people not wanting to go to holiday gatherings because they wanted to avoid having these really tough discussions and having these arguments over politics and other divisive topics. So this, the whole last year of high-profile elections, certainly in the US, but also around the world, really highlights what kind of attention is being driven toward these types of divisions. And these kind of social divides are indeed widening, and it's a long-term trend that we've been seeing over a number of years. But I think if we turn that around and think about what is the opportunity, certainly the first opportunity is to think about, do you know what your audiences feel? Do you know how your target consumers feel about core issues, especially when they're divisive issues? And which of these align with your brand, and how do you think about leaning into those or staying away from them? It's not a right answer for every brand or for every category. But at the same time, we can also look for different ways that we are potentially coming together. One of the webinars that we hosted recently with our public affairs team, who does all of our political polling, brought up a great point that oftentimes the divisive rhetoric is part of what people are responding to as well. And in fact, there are a lot of core values and a lot of things that many, many people agree on if you can find a way to frame it in a way that is not divisive and not tapping into the really kind of hot button issues and topics, that there are still things that we agree on. So I think that's the good news. And a lot of sentiment in terms of alignment here, in terms of how people are thinking, how generations are feeling fairly similarly. So when we think about, what does this mean? If we're in this kind of centrifugal era where people are pulling farther and further apart, how do you find that mass appeal? How do you speak to people in a way that's going to resonate? Do you take a stand on issues is really a tough question. And what we're thinking is that individuals, they do say that they seek out brands that align with their values, that they shop based on their values and beliefs. And yet that's different for every category. So really understanding and diving into things like, are there ways that within your house of brands, you can potentially speak to different audiences on either side of the spectrum of an issue? Certainly EVs are part of that. It may be something that you can position to one part of the audience and speak very differently to another part of the audience, either through parts of your lines or through your different brands. So thinking about ways that you can segment and really speak to your consumers in a different way. At the same time, the moments that unite us still assume greater importance. So to that point about what do we agree on despite all of this divisiveness, there are certainly ways that we can create content that reaches across those divides and taps into potentially tribalism and fandom. Can we all set aside our differences and agree that we love a particular brand? I think there's a lot of potential in that. And that really, brings us to the third point, that there's a challenge for organizations internally as well as externally. And the prompt here is, how do you think about engaging in genuine and transparent communication with your employees and all of your stakeholders internally as well, that helps them understand that you're reflecting their values, but also is mindful of all the diverse perspectives within your staff and across the value chain? So tricky questions to navigate, but certainly understanding how people feel about those issues is really the first step in navigating that. On that topic of divisiveness, this one is interesting because I would say climate convergence and this trend around climate and how people feel about climate has actually changed over time, and dramatically so, especially in the US in the past 10 years. And the macro environment is that, climate is changing rapidly, and a lot of people now do agree with this, that globally views on how important climate change have started to coalesce and converge. So that's the convergence piece of this. But the tension is where we diverge is that how far and how fast we need to change and who's responsible for that change is really where the divergence comes. So it's both a convergence in terms of this is an issue that we need to deal with, this is real, and yet a divergence in terms of who needs to act, how quickly, where it needs to be a lead issue versus other things like economics and affordability. It's certainly a big part of the conversation and certainly something that we're seeing play out in terms of the wider population. So when we think about the driving forces, obviously the first one is climate change events, and the rapid increase and severity of those events has really helped propel this forward. If you look at the attitudinal shifts, and this is true in the US as well as globally, that many more people, a majority of people agree that we're headed for an environmental disaster unless we change our habits. So really striking in terms of how much agreement there is on that sentiment. And yet there's a lot of disagreement about what should be done about it, what are the right solutions, and who's responsible. So we start to see some interesting innovations come out in terms of recognizing the carbon footprint in places that we don't normally talk about it, innovations in terms of materials, of course, and a lot more transparency, for example, the carbon calculator that you see here. At the same time, though, there are still dividing lines that emerge. As I mentioned, despite this remarkable convergence in public opinion over the past decade, and that's true across markets as well as generations, that most people agree that we're in dire straits. And yet there's a divergence and a debate about how fast we act and who should bear the cost. And that's kind of the polarizing piece of it. And we do start to see some differences in terms of generations here as well. For example, millennial Americans feeling that they're already doing everything that they can to save the environment, whereas older generations and younger generations are potentially answering very differently. So really interesting to think about how people are making decisions and how they understand the impact of their decisions, both on a daily basis as well as those big ticket items. So when we think about the implications on this one, the public are really looking for, I think, both political and brand as well as economic leadership on climate. And one of the things that we saw, very early in all of the announcements that came out was, President Trump's first act in office, one of the first acts, was to roll back the 50% EV target. I'm sure this is, a big part of conversation within your organizations, but we're starting to see, signs that this is changing. Obviously, that doesn't have an impact on state level or other types of regulation, but it certainly signals where the administration is planning to go regarding EVs. And we see a lot of that in other types of energy decisions as well. And meanwhile, we do see incidents of greenwashing where companies, particularly in the past several years, not so much recently, have made statements that are generally window dressing, and they really aren't necessarily meaningfully changes. So there's a lot of debate and a lot of cynicism that's coming through in the public about the ability to actually make a change and to reach net zero. So thinking there about how can your organization highlight positive examples, things that you are doing, while of course walking a fine line between going too far and potentially going back to that splintered societies moment where people are being divisive on certain types of topics. So again, really understanding what your audience cares about and what the right way is in terms of talking to them. So the third idea here is about, one way of getting people to make big changes is to start with smaller ones. And we think there's an opportunity here for brands to put additional effort into smaller steps that can have an impact, individually, but symbolically are important for the public to see and do. So what are those small steps that you can start to put into place to really give a sense of where things are moving, again, without being, too divisive or going too far in terms of the other side of the coin? So the next trend is around technology, and this one has a really interesting tension as well. Techno wonder being both sides of that term, the wonder in terms of people being really excited about technology and thinking that, frankly, we need modern technology to solve future problems. And a lot of excitement about certainly what generative AI can do in the past couple of years. There's been so many improvements that people are using it in completely new ways, even very creative ways as their assistants and as part of their lifestyles. But at the same time, the other side of that tension is that many people think technical progress and technology is destroying our lives. So it's something that has significantly risen over the last 10 years that we've been studying this. And part of that is about the debate of the impact on our mental health and our careers. We don't always see the benefits of technology or tech companies. So the beauty and the convenience is really on one side of this. We need technology. We know we're using it right now, but we certainly see the potential downside of that and the vulnerabilities around it. So that creates an interesting tension because on the one hand, this is very much being driven by advances in generative AI in different types of automation, and certainly being driven and enabled by the exponential data that's available to companies and available to consumers as well. And yet the other piece of it is technology's dark side and the potential impact and negative impact of technology on our lives. So that's something that we're seeing reflected in terms of global attitudes around this sentiment of progress destroying our lives, tech progress destroying our lives, has really gone up considerably around the world. And this is true in the US as well. So part of this is being addressed by tech companies who are starting to study the role of AI in job loss, for example, to help offset those worries. But part of it is certainly coming to fruition in terms of new innovations, new technology that are coming online as well, that certainly can have a big impact on other types of factors, such as the environment. So people are really wondering at technology in terms of the positive side, and yet worrying that it's gone too far. Globally, we see that a lot of citizens think that we need technology to solve problems as a society. So thinking about ways, for example, that AI can help us solve these big, tricky problems where humans haven't been able to make a lot of headway. And there's a lot of division about whether AI is good or bad. People see the positive side of it, but they're also worried about, losing jobs. Think of it as a creative partner, but also worried that we're losing human agency. So a lot of debate and hope, but also fear about the impact of AI and technology on our lives. So when we think about this in terms of the implications for automotive, really what we're thinking about is, technology is a must. It's certainly something that's expected, that people want, but something that we can also think about in terms of crowdsourcing. We do know that data is necessary in terms of autonomous driving, and crowdsourcing that information is part of how we prevent accidents, but it's not necessarily something that consumers think about. So is there an opportunity to help them see the positive side, and in so doing lessen the worry about data privacy, really bringing that to the forefront in terms of how we talk about the technology in cars? The second point here being, just because people feel an inevitable decrease in their privacy, which we've seen in the data as well, that people feel just because of the way the world is going and because of technology change, that their privacy is due to decrease. But they're not necessarily happy about it. So how can you help them feel confident sharing data and information, especially in making them more comfortable in the value exchange and talking about, by sharing your data, this is how we can improve your experience and improve your ride. And the third point here being that people know generally that technology is used in a lot of things that they do every day, but not necessarily about how much AI and how many algorithms are part of that. So one of the things that we suggest to clients is to focus less on the how, the mechanics of the technology, and much more on the benefits that they get from using products and services. So really being focused on what you get out of it in order to assuage some of those fears. The next one is around conscientious health, and this is really something that we've seen for a long time, changing, meaning that 10 years ago, we would have said that this was really focused on physical health, and a lot of people around the world do focus on physical health as one of their priorities, but they're also really interested in mental health, and that has certainly changed since the pandemic. We saw inklings of it beforehand, but it's become much more socially acceptable to talk about mental health and to seek mental wellness as part of your overall holistic well-being. The other piece of it that started to come out now is a real understanding of how interconnected our environments are and our communities are to our health as well. So thinking about big systems like access to food, access to technology, how much green space there is in the neighborhood where you live, this bigger understanding of what impacts our health is definitely part of conscientious health and how we're thinking about the trend now. And certainly there's a trend because people are looking at mental and physical health as two sides of the same coin, but also a lot of opportunity in terms of how technology is enabling different health outcomes as well. So when we think about the driving forces here, certainly there is a big impact from a tech standpoint, not just, the wearables that we all have on our wrists, but also through breakthrough technologies. That was a big part of the silver lining of the pandemic in terms of vaccine being able to be developed earlier. But we're also looking at the impacts of things like systemic health inequalities between consumers, who has access to doctors online, who has access to different types of technologies and different types of medical procedures. So we start to see that attitudinal shifts are happening, and there's a little bit of a tick up that people want more control. So there's a desire for more agency around health and about this kind of different types of health, both physical and mental, but also a lot more conversation about all of the factors of healthcare and of well-being. The example at the top here being a lot more attention paid to caring for the caregivers. So the people who are in our lives who take care of others, as well as people who are in that profession, being more thoughtful about what care looks like for them as well. And then thinking too about how technology can aid both our physical and our mental health beyond the wearables that we have on, and how that can potentially be woven into other types of systems. So when we think about what this looks like moving forward, one of the things that came out is that it's definitely this holistic pursuit of longevity. So it's not just health for health's sake today, but it's wellness long term. And people are really interested in, looking after their long-term physical and mental health, but they're also looking ahead to how are they going to be healthy long term? What does that marginal decade, will they be able to retire and still be active? Will they be able to, for example, pick up grandchildren and do that safely? So it's interesting to think about this as a connection point to longevity and what that health span looks like long term. At the same time, there's still this growing concern about mental health, and that the gap between prioritizing physical and mental health has shrunk, but it's still a big concern in terms of people really looking to improve their mental well-being. Certainly, this is impacted by things that are happening in the world around us, but at the same time, enabled by new technologies and different medical approaches as well. So lots of opportunities in this trend to think about how we're caring for one another and how our products and services can care for consumers as well. So as we start to think about how this, holistic view of health, mental, emotional, physical, is really coming together, how can we holistically take that to tackle big challenges? One of the things that we were thinking of as we were pulling this together is how might our vehicles be an enabler of better health outcomes in the future, particularly, for example, in regions or parts of the country with limited medical infrastructure? Is there a role for automotive to provide remote diagnostics or virtual doctor's visits in the future? As we think about technology being credited for, both advances in health management and yet blamed, as I mentioned earlier, for contributing to some of our problems, how can we balance this promotion of digital tools with the need to mitigate safety issues? What is the right balance in terms of looking for just enough technology without being overwhelming? And the last point here being about how can organizations and brands address the challenges of aging populations? That's a big part of what we're looking at when we talk about ongoing health and health spans. That the population in the US in particular is aging, but true in many parts of the world as well. So how can we think about promoting sustainable lifestyle choices that contribute to long-term health and agency, help keep them in charge of their health, but also help keep them safe throughout their lives? The next one I think is one that it causes a lot of interesting questions and debate, and this is rooted in a lot of the trends that we've done over the past 10 years around nostalgia. But I think the twist here is that it's really a focus on old systems, and meaning the looking back to different types of gender norms, households, roles, even roles within the workplace, and wanting to go back to quote unquote the way it used to be. And we see this reflected in people's sentiment about wanting their country to go back to the way it used to be as well. So it's really intermingled between this nostalgia for the way that my country used to be, nostalgia for the way that my household used to be, and potentially a pushback on the demands that we feel. One example of this, for example, is the TradWise trend, which is what this picture references. And really interesting from a consumer psychology perspective to think about what is that clamor for a return to history? Is it a pushback on all of the demands of modern life in a way? We certainly see that as one of the threads. But I think the caveat at the same time is that going back to the way things were, it can be a very sanitized view of the past. So we have to be careful about how we're leaning into that nostalgia without going too far and disenfranchising parts of our audience. So as we think about what's driving this, you'll see some of these macro forces come to the forefront again. And I think that's true as we're thinking about all of the macro forces and trends. They don't necessarily happen in isolation, but they happen as different pieces of the whole. So you'll see a lot of connective tissue between the trends and between the macro forces influencing one another. So for example, rising nationalism and populism, that's part of this sentiment of wanting the country to go back to the way it used to be, this sense of nostalgia, which is a reflection of increasing migration and displacement, increasing tensions around immigration policy, and certainly a reflection of wealth disparity, how people are responding to a difficult economic environment. And then starting to think about, maybe our parents had it better, maybe past generations had it better. Are there ways that we can go back to this? So the ways that we see this playing out, I mentioned the trad wife lifestyle, but there's certainly, a lot of harkening back to styles and even technologies and products from a bygone era. In fact, we've heard a lot of stories of people going back to quote unquote simpler times by switching to a flip phone or a dumb phone. So moving away from technology because the past was better, the past was simpler in a lot of ways. So as we think about the implications here, part of the reason we think that this is happening is that old structures are appealing because the future and the present day is so uncertain. So people are in a big way responding to a lot of uncertainty and a lot of change. But it's not just about simple nostalgia. It's really about that returning to power and control. I think control is a theme that you'll see come through a lot of these trends as well, that people are looking to find a way to control or to feel more secure because the world around them is so uncertain and it's changing so quickly. And we saw that Americans are especially keen to wish for the past, more so than a lot of other countries. And that could look like idealizing the simplicity or perceived ease of bygone age. You also see a lot of people watching TV from past generations and thinking back to, oh, how nice it was that, no one had cell phones on this show, or life seemed so simple back in the 70s. So it's partly a retreat to structures that feel familiar, but partly this wistfulness of looking back at the past. And part of it is really cueing traditions as well, which is interesting for the automotive sector as well, to think about how do you tap into the nostalgia from a tradition perspective? What's the right way in to really help people feel that they're connected to that past and feel that they're connected to those traditions? So when we think about the implications here, it's really a theme of how can organizations ensure a relationship with the past is a healthy one and is going in the right direction. So there's certainly a way to leverage nostalgia, but it's not necessarily straightforward, especially when technology has really changed the category. So it means that we need to have a deep understanding of the drivers behind this idealization of the past and how to blend that with modern considerations. We're not going to get rid of technology, and certainly people don't want that. But how do you balance what we have today versus what people are looking for in the past? Is there a brand equity that you can tap into in terms of the history of a vehicle or a brand that also is balanced with today's technologies and certainly new features? The other one that's really interesting when we're talking about brands and about, balance is masculinity and gender norms. And that's definitely intertwined with the history of the automotive category, especially in America. So thinking very creatively about how do you embrace that tradition and really tap into that sense without necessarily alienating those who align along more progressive lines. So again, is there a balance in terms of your messaging and communication? Or going back to what we were saying earlier, is there an opportunity to think about within your brand portfolio? Are there certain brands that speak more to traditional gender norms, traditional masculinity, versus others that are a bit more progressive? How can you potentially segment based on some of those perspectives? And the last point here is that nostalgia isn't necessarily, it's not going to solve every problem, and it's not a solution for everyone. In fact, there's some that are anti-nostalgia, even though others are embracing elements of the past. So how can you think about leveraging nostalgia without seeming old-fashioned? I think that's a real watch out in terms of how we tap into nostalgia. You don't want to seem like you're being left behind in terms of how the world is evolving around us. The next trend around nouveau nihilism is also one that's caused a lot of questions and debate. And I think what's really sparking with people on this one is we've seen a big generational disconnect when it comes to milestones. So we've seen a lot of conversation happening, especially in the US, around feeling like traditional milestones, particularly for Gen Z, are frankly out of reach, that they're looking at the housing market, they're looking at their ability to, feel financially secure, to have a secure career as potentially something that is just not possible. And part of that is a reaction to, the very real economic circumstances that we're in. But part of it is also a reaction to, how milestones are set, how success is defined. And it's a very real reaction to what's happening in the world around us. So people looking at everything that we just talked about, technological change, political change, environmental change, and potentially saying, you know what, I can't control any of that. There are so many negative things happening in the world. I'm just going to live for today because that's all that really matters at the moment. And either tomorrow will take care of itself, we don't need to worry about it today, or tomorrow is so uncertain that I can't deal with it. So it's interesting to even tease this apart into those two different themes of either I'm not worried about it, it's going to take care of itself, or I am worried about it and I really can't deal with it. So one of the things that we're starting to see come through in terms of the driving forces is, as I mentioned, a lot of those bigger macro forces like climate change, technological change, political change, especially a pushback on institutions and expectations of what people should be achieving by when, how structures are built to support consumers or not, and a lot of pushback on institutions, especially government institutions. So it's something that we're seeing happen around the world. That there's a big increase in terms of people thinking that it's better to just enjoy life today, that tomorrow will take care of itself. Whether that's driven by apathy, as we saw Ben and Jerry's trying to offset that in the election in the fall, or the brat summer of last summer, is really interesting. But there's a big watch out here as well. So, for example, what we're seeing is that there's a big increasing amount of debt in buy now, pay later programs, especially with younger consumers who are using it for more and more for necessities like groceries. But we're also starting to hear that they're using it to buy luxury items much, much earlier in life than past generations. So, does that mean that they're potentially getting themselves into trouble and getting themselves into debt? Remains to be seen. There's not a lot that we can see underneath the default rate for buy now, pay later. But I think it raises a good question about how do you live for today, throw caution to the wind a little bit, and also encourage consumers to save for the future and to invest in their future. So that's really the new news about nihilism. It's not necessarily just that nothing matters. That's maybe how we would have thought about it 20 years ago. This is much more about looking at what's happening around us and looking at the fact that people are overwhelmed, that they're specifically thinking about the lessons from the pandemic, that life is fragile, life is short, and sometimes it is okay to live for today. So we think that those lessons from the pandemic will especially shape attitudes and behaviors for long term, for decades to come, in particular for people who were at the formative age of being in high school and college, young adulthood. During that time, it's a lesson that's going to be kind of baked into their worldview. So as we think about how to message creatively, one of the things that really struck us is that very few Americans say that they're optimistic about the world in the next 12 months. So how do we think about, messaging and advice that resonates with people who are feeling really frustrated, really focused on living today, and really kind of, feeling like they're detached from some of the bigger institutions? So when we think about this from an automotive sector, one of the things that we were thinking about is it might be good news. On the one hand, if people are splurging, they could be thinking about, what, I'm gonna go ahead and get the new car and get a nicer car because success in other realms feels out of reach. Maybe they're looking to have something nice today and enjoy it while it lasts because they're not planning on buying a house or they're not going to start a family. So it's an interesting way to kind of flip this around and look at it as an opportunity as well. But by the same token, I mentioned financial strain. It could be on the rise if consumers aren't careful. So how do we encourage them to act responsibly? Yes, splurging a little bit now, but not getting too deep into debt. What are some of the opportunities there to think about financing and think about different responsible programs? And then the last point here was, disengagement. As people are kind of feeling like they're disenfranchised, that the systems don't work for them or aren't set out to help them succeed. More people who are spending time at home, not socializing, not traveling as much, may mean that there are fewer service appointments and getting out of the house. So is there a challenge in keeping people upbeat about buying a car and getting them more engaged? Even if it's something that they're using less often. So we've seen a lot of change in terms of lifestyles, and potentially more need for engagement and kind of drawing people out of their shell. The second to last one is around the power of trust. And we've been looking at this for a long time, even beyond the 10-year survey, as Ipsos, and you'll see a lot of similar reports from other agencies who've been studying trust over the long term, agreeing that it's been declining overall. And this is true in the US as well as other countries. But I think what's new about this is that there's a very distinct difference starting to shape up. Certainly that there's a decline in trust in institutions and in governments and even experts and scientists. But at the same time, there's an increasing trust in individuals. So part of this is driven by uncertainty, but part of it is also driven by how people feel connected to systems versus people. And the interesting thing about connecting to individuals and trusting individuals is it doesn't have to be people that an individual knows personally. It could be an influencer, it could be a personality on a podcast, but that singular person, and brands could also play this role, really is taking the place of bigger institutions. So as we think about this going forward, certainly it's a reflection on things like the rising cost of living, some of that disenfranchisement and frustration with the powers that be, how governments are acting. But we also see that reflected in a replacement of trust, with people wanting to buy brands that reflect their personal values because they trust those brands. So that has been on the rise increasingly over the past 10 years. And we start to see a lot of, in this realm of trust, a lot of discussion and regulation around transparency, not just in terms of what companies are willing to divulge themselves in terms of their transparency about operations and finances, but a push from the outside as well. And that's tied into this kind of concept of value alignment, that how you spend your money should be aligned with who you trust and which brands you trust. But we're starting to see that really come out to play very differently depending on the category. So when we think about this from a customer experience perspective, that's a really interesting angle too, because as we start to see these tensions created by this confluence of competing changes, the rapid technological development, shifting attitudes to global versus local, it starts to really bring about this perspective that buying brands that reflect their personal values is important, and yet at the same time, people say, I don't really care if the brand is socially responsible. So they just want them to make good products. So it's really interesting to then drill down into specific category attitudes off the back of that. And what we're seeing is that, there's an opportunity here for customer experience to really emerge as the value that could enable trust or could imperil trust and equity. So it's really something to think about in terms of, if people are looking for that connection point from an individual level, how do you enable that from a customer experience standpoint? Or the flip side, is there a potential watch out or a danger there in terms of people not feeling connected to the brand? That customer experience can really make or break that brand trust and equity. So as we think about what this means for the category and the industry, one of the things was, if people are trusting individuals more than institutions, what does that mean for your brand in the equation? Are you delivering individual influencers through social media? Are there current owners that you could tap into more, whether that's in an advertisement or through other channels? What is the role of dealers and key opinion leaders in this whole landscape? All of those could be considered individuals in terms of who people are trusting. The second point being, how are you investing consumers in your brand's values? And one of the things that we're thinking about here is, do your consumers trust that you have the integrity and competence, as well as benevolence to do what you say that you'll do? That's such a big part of trust that I think is something that is worth revisiting from time to time. And the last part here being thinking about how shifts to AI and automated customer service systems can be communicated in a way that really accentuates their positives instead of, the positives of increased access, for example, rather than being seen as a loss of human contact. So can that automation provide the same level of service, but also potentially provide a way to contact a human if and when you need to? And the last trend before we get into questions, so thank you for sticking with us, is really, I think, the most positive. Not to say that the other ones are not positive. I think if you turn around the negative, they're all, opportunities for us to really understand consumers and get deep into their mindsets. But this one is really about looking at those same things that we were talking about that are changing in the world, that feels overwhelming and potentially threatening, that people are taking that same stimulus and saying, you know what, I can't control all of that, but I can control how I respond. I can control the decisions that I make. And it's a focus on individualism that is, yes, about self-expression, but it's much more this year about personal autonomy. That's something that really popped for a big part of the values in our study, both for this year as well as for Americans in particular. So yes, it's about self-expression, but much more we're seeing a lot about achievement, about building social status, as well as self-expression. And a lot of that is about self-development and kind of slowing the world down and focusing on what you can control. So it's being driven by a lot of increasing identity acceptance, but also being influenced by the rise and fall of middle classes, the economic environment that people find themselves in, and also influenced by a shift that we're seeing in terms of people really kind of questioning what the success metrics look like. So broadly, people agree around the world that, it's up to everybody to work out their own principles and guide their decisions. And part of that we're seeing reflected in the workplace and how people are thinking about their careers, especially younger generations, kind of pushing back on the live to work mentality and saying, I want to have other hobbies. I want to think about managing my stress. I want to focus on other things. It doesn't mean that I need to follow the same career path or the same success path, the same life stages that previous generations have followed. I want to be more curious and I want to really think about more of what I can do within my own life. So it's not necessarily a me first in terms of just a selfishness mindset. It's much more about control and individualism. So focusing on what they can control is a big part of it. But as I mentioned, a big need for personal autonomy. And I thought this was really fascinating that almost 70% of Americans said they were interested in learning survival skills to become self-sufficient. So is that a pandemic hangover, perhaps? But it also ties into our culture in terms of the US and how people are really focused on, bootstrapping and the pioneering spirit. It's part of our culture and part of our history as well. And I think the other piece of this that's really interesting to dive into too is that some of this may be a reaction to this state of overwhelm. People are being constantly pinged with a barrage of media, of advertisements, social media, internet, what have you, all day into the evening in their personal lives and at work. And that really can create a state of overwhelm and perhaps a state of too many choices. In fact, we saw this really pop for Gen Z, that they felt overwhelmed by too many choices in life, much more so than older generations. So despite being relatively young and looking at, how much of the world is their oyster, that constant barrage of information is too much choice in many cases, too much information and too much uncertainty. So a reaction to this decade of rising unpredictability is really where we think this is coming from. So what does that mean? It means that unlocking opportunity in the age of the individual it needs to be much more targeted. And as we were thinking about the implications, we certainly see that personal vehicles are, that's a wonderful literal mode of autonomy and agency, even self-expression that, it's one of the first things that at least in my generation, people needed a car, wanted a car so that they could be on their own, so they could go wherever they wanted. That's potentially changing. So what does that look like in terms of brands striking the right balance between, what people are looking for in terms of the automotive category, but also striking the right balance between mass messaging and individual needs for the right person? How do you tailor those needs, tailor that messaging to speak to individual needs when they're so different? The second point here being expectations of different generations are really being shaped by the rapid pace of information and change. So how can you think about tailoring strategies to address those concerns of each generation? Should you have different messaging for younger audiences versus older, especially around things like technology in the vehicle? And the third point here being, look, there are a lot of different opinions about how to behave. A lot of people disagree, but there's also an opportunity to think about how vehicles give freedom and control, making them almost the perfect expression of this trend in response to a world that's really changing rapidly around us. So lots to think about there, but I will open it up for questions in just a moment. Leave you with this thought as we do, that there are many, many ways for us to think about how to use the Ipsos Global Trends within your organization. One very common one is to embed them into your strategic planning, both the macro forces and the trends, so that as you're going into those long-term strategy sessions, that it's another input that you can use to think about the consumers, where they're coming from, what their mindsets and motivations are. Second opportunity, we can certainly dive deeper into any of the trends and customize them to your category and business questions. And a lot of our clients do that as well. And we're happy to answer questions individually afterwards as well if you're interested. But we also encourage people to just use them as they are and build them into briefs, thinking about how you talk to your creative agencies. Are there ways to tap into the trends as you're building creative and thinking about your next campaigns? And then, of course, infusing those bigger macro forces that we talked about at the beginning to really future-proof your insights. And that is something that we're doing a lot with clients to say, for example, if you're doing a big piece of research with clients, with consumers, such as the segmentation, there's a way to infuse all of these into the design of the study at the beginning to make sure that the results are really future-proofed and future-facing. So lots of opportunities to think about in terms of utilizing all of these. But we're happy to pause for conversations, and actually I can bring Graham on as well.
Perfect. Thank you, Jennifer. Really amazing stuff. Lots of really dense information, which is great to kind of action on that. If you have not yet had a chance to send something to me for the Q&A, please do so now. I've got a couple questions already, and as they continue to fall in, I'll be able to prompt Jennifer and see what we can answer. To start off with, the nihilism trend, you mentioned it seems rooted in attitudes of the younger generations. Are they delaying these milestones, or are they rejecting these milestones outright?
That is a great question. I would say it's both. So in some cases, we're seeing people, definitely we've seen a demographic trend, especially in the US, of looking at forming households later, people having children later in life, getting married later, but they're also potentially not choosing some of those milestones. So for example, if you look at the declining birth rate, fewer people are having children. So it's not just that they're having them later, but they're potentially choosing not to for various reasons. The other thing that we're seeing, especially in housing, I think is really interesting, is either delaying because of affordability or just rejecting them and saying, that's not my priority. I would rather travel, or I would rather do other things with my money. Some of it may be rooted in today, some of it may be other types of spending, but really interesting to think about both, that it could be delaying or it could be rejecting, depending on the milestone and depending on the person.
Okay. Yeah. In my mind, the thing that we've seen, not necessarily with the younger generations, but overall, is that the people who are intending their next vehicle may be kind of extending that trade cycle of buying the new vehicle and trading in the new one. So it's kind of the same idea, right? I'm holding on to this while I can, and then maybe using that money for other milestones or just for savings. I have two questions that kind of overlap with each other, talking about navigating the uncertainty of the government policies, and you also mentioned splintered societies. When these opinions and these policies are changing more rapidly, How can those brands react and navigate to that?
It's a great question and something that's come up with a lot of our clients recently. I would say number one, get your internal groups together. And we've seen a lot of clients do that really successfully. For example, we had a client recently who had a strategy team who was looking at risk factors. And so they had a whole list of all of these macro forces that they had researched and that they were planning to present to the board of directors. And yet the insights team didn't have access to that. So number one, getting your teams aligned and breaking down those silos is not an easy task, but that's where a lot of the value comes in terms of knowing who's tracking what, how you can potentially put those together to give the organization a clearer picture of all the types of change from risk factors, from reputational risk, corporate communications, insights, foresight, if you happen to have a team internally who works on that. So I'd say that's number one, is getting all of those teams together and combining those insights and those data streams. Number two, I think scenario planning can be really helpful for organizations, especially when we're in this kind of environment where policies are being, rolled out on a minute by minute basis, potentially being blocked and gone backwards in other cases. So what's really tricky, I think, is anticipating what could happen, but having that scenario in place and thinking about, look, putting it on the table, all these things could happen. We have a reasonably good view of what could happen in terms of either the new administration or other actors within the corporate world. What could your competitors do in response? Putting all of that on the table and saying, here are the most critical factors that we think could happen, could have an impact on our business. Whether you do that internally or with a facilitator doesn't matter. But I think putting all of that data together, laying it all out and saying, here are the potential possibilities, that this is what the future could look like in the next 1, 3, 5 years. Here's how our competitors would respond. Here's what the government action would be. What's the impact on our business? What would we do? And having all of that laid out in advance is really critical. And that's what's enabled people to really respond quickly, for corporations to be able to have a message ready to go as soon as there's a government action, or a response to a policy change ready to go, or a response to a competitor. So it really takes a lot of planning internally, but I think that's a critical learning for everyone in terms of plan for the unexpected.
Excellent. Thank you. Our next question, is national pride cyclical? Are we on this slippery slope of increasing national pride and decreasing globalization, and kind of, when is it going to sway the other way, if at all?
That's a great question. I can answer from a broad view, and then I would love to hear your perspective from the automotive side as well. It looks like it is something that is somewhat cyclical, but starting to slide down into permanence, especially in the US. So I think that, it's going to continue its current trajectory in terms of slipping national pride. And what our experts are saying is that could change depending on if there's a global event. So things like pandemic, things like global political conflicts do have an impact, and that could change. So if there's another big global event or a national conflict event, that could have an impact. But short of that, we would say that generally plan for it to continue on the current trajectory.
Okay. Yeah, from the automotive side, it's interesting because for a lot of products, if we're talking, global trends and just consumer trends, a lot of products will maybe advertise made in the USA, and automotive does that to a certain point. But like you said in one of your trends, right, the domestic OEMs aren't necessarily fully domestic, and the imports aren't necessarily fully imports. So when it comes to that national pride, it's more so from a brand loyalty aspect than it is, what flag they represent. So I'm not necessarily sure if it's cyclical, but it definitely is something that is a thumbprint of the automotive world. Here's one about ESG. When we're talking about the backlash against ESG, which is not as bad as the backlash against DEI that we've seen from the Trump administration so far, isn't that backlash kind of hampering what companies can do to address those environmental issues?
That's a great question. And we actually have a global ESG study that just came out from Ipsos that talks about how to navigate all of this. So I think that's a great resource. But I would also say that it depends, because there may be things that, and we've seen this happen in a lot of corporations, they're continuing to do what they were doing. They're just not being as vocal about it. So it could be that you stay on your trajectory, looking at the long term, knowing that climate change is not going to reverse itself, knowing that there will likely be different policies in the future with different administrations, and stay the course and perhaps not be messaging it in the same way. So I think that's a really tricky territory to navigate for the industry. But I'm curious for your perspective on EVs in particular.
Makes sense. I'm just going through these as we're receiving them, but
Sure.
I had one that I thought of as we were going through, so I wanted to pick your brain. You were talking about trust, and I think trust for the automotive industry is becoming a bigger deal, because there's whether or not, we trust your capabilities to create better electric vehicles, or we trust in, automotive driving systems to keep us away from accidents. That word is getting bounced around a lot lately. But one thing that I found interesting, you mentioned AI, and that's neither an individual or an institution. And those are kind of the two words that you would use. But AI is kind of this third thing. So as AI is kind of digging its feet into our lives more, and especially in the corporate world, where is it going to fill that niche between the individual, who's a bit more personable but micro, versus the institution that's more macro but impersonable?
That's such a great question. And I think it depends on the use case of AI. So for example, if you think about how your organization, for example, we have our own wall garden AI system platform here within Ipsos. People may think about employees would probably think about that from an institutional perspective of that's how AI is being used by the organization. But that's very different from how people are using it on an individual level. So when people are using, for example, Gemini or another tool to help them be creative or help them write, help them do things for work, but it's more from an individual perspective, that may be classified more as an individual because it's seen as a helping hand and seen as a counterpart and one of the tools that you use. So I think it can be both, which makes it really tricky to navigate, that it could be viewed as an institution. And that may be true of, when you're looking at, for example, perspectives on a particular tool that's part of Google or that's part of OpenAI. That may be viewed as an institution because it's part of the corporate level versus the application within, in particular. I'm thinking of, for example, a study that we're doing on helpfulness in tech right now. And there's so many instances where AI is already being used in programs, in apps, in devices that we have and love. So in a lot of cases, people don't even think of it. They're using AI and they don't even necessarily associate it with an individual or an institution. If you think about the algorithms that are controlling what you see when you log into Netflix, or how Google Maps is figuring out the best navigation route to avoid traffic. All of those are examples of AI as well, but they don't fit into either camp. So it's interesting to surface those examples of AI as well and help people think about, this isn't necessarily something that is an institution and is therefore not trustworthy. It's something in between that can be really personally valuable to
Excellent. So if we're talking about, I'm sorry, I think my internet cut out for a second. Perfect, thank you. So another one on trust. How can auto dealers help kind of generate that trust and encourage the idea of vehicles as that form of personal expression? Because that's a big part of the car buying process.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Trust may be, I think, coming through in terms of the dealers as well, and in terms of servicing and what your experience has been with the brand through all of those different facets, whether it's contacting a dealer to ask about it, going for a test drive, calling the service center, all of that can be part of building trust. And it goes back to that point about how important customer experience is as part of that. So I think it's tricky in terms of navigating, as with all of these, it's tricky to navigate, but it's certainly something that can be dialed up. And I think to your point about brand equity, that can certainly instill trust as well. So really diving into what are the aspects or the attributes, I would say, within our brand health tracker that are tied to trust and that help instill trust. Are we performing well on those? Is there any kind of a watch out in terms of a dip or a flattening? And how does that compare to how people feel about competitors? So my guess is that everyone has a lot of those trackers in place already. We're really thinking critically about which of those elements of your brand equity relate to trust and trustworthiness, and then how that relates to the customer experience as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'll hit one more piece on that, because the idea of the auto dealers, whether it's fair or not, is the idea of trust versus distrust.
Mhm.
What we see in some of our data is that personal expression within the vehicle buying process is slightly down. It's not hugely down, but it is something that's becoming a bit less important as utilitarian aspects of the car buying process becomes more important. So on the auto dealer side, a couple things, right? For the people that still do find that self-expression, I think that's why the automakers are having more specialty trims, especially for some of the more fun vehicles they have. But like you said, I think trust comes first and foremost from that brand equity, right? Do I trust that you're going to be able to, do what I want with the vehicle that you are selling me? Do I think that you have a right to play with the different spaces that you're trying to get into, apart from the, four wheels and an engine aspect of the car?
Right.
And then from the service side, post-purchase, do I trust that I'm getting a good deal when I'm continuing to spend money on something that I've already spent $30,000+ on? I've got one more question here regarding the climate change issue and the tendency to choose brands that reflect that personal image. What can you tell us about Tesla in light of Elon Musk and his work with Doge?
Oh, that is a hot question right now. We've seen a lot of consumers, a lot of conversation about it. And I would say, a couple of years ago, people would have been, and I'm broadly generalizing here. I think people would have been really on board much more so with Tesla as a symbol of EVs, meaning not really closely connected to, Elon's whatever he was doing with X or any of the other pursuits. Um, but that was all before the government connection, I'll say. And I think that is really interesting to see how that's playing out in terms of consumer behavior and even how consumers are reacting to each other. I'll give you one example. A friend reached out to someone who had bought another friend had bought a Tesla and said, "Hey, I know that you did this last year, like a year and a half ago, before a lot of this came to light in terms of the founders' integration into the government. Do you regret that purchase?" So I think that's super fascinating from a consumer behavior perspective. Very rarely would you see people asking each other these pointed questions about why did you make that purchase? It doesn't happen in other big ticket items like buying a house, buying other going on vacation, but it's happening now in terms of, your political stance being reflected in the car that you buy. So I don't think there's an easy answer there in terms of how Tesla navigates that, but it's really fascinating to think about what were the motivations 1, 2, 3 years ago in terms of buying a Tesla. How has that changed, and how are other consumers potentially influencing behavior and whether people are interested in buying that brand? I don't think there's a clear answer yet, but really fascinating to look at how things are evolving and how attitudes are evolving, both between the consumer and the brand, and then from consumer to consumer.
Yeah, definitely. And in the research that I've seen, obviously there's still overlap between, Tesla and someone who's, active and conscious about climate change. But the other thing that we see is if you look at battery electric vehicle owners and then a subset of Tesla versus non-Tesla, Tesla owners have very different opinions, just like attitudes and internal ideas about, self and society versus regular traditional OEM battery electric vehicle owners. So a lot of it just kind of comes down to that cult of personality. I think there can be some shifting in the needle there, but a lot of Tesla advocates are Tesla advocates. I know I said that was the last question, but I did scroll down and I saw one more short one, and I can maybe take this briefly.
Sure.
Your views on how to take advantage of consumer increased interest in health. And that was one of the trends that I think you and I were talking about that is a little bit less applicable to the automotive industry. But the thing that I do see is when it comes to increased interest in health, a lot of it is not so much a healthy lifestyle, but it's preventative, right? And we're talking about accident avoidance and making sure that you can get from point A to point B safely. And that is something that we see definitely climbing the ranks within, the features or the innovations that people want to see from the automotive industry. It's all safety based. It's all getting rid of the accidents, making sure that you are safe and secure. Not so much the entertainment, but that health aspect being make sure I live to see another day.
Well, that's also interesting if you think about, autonomous driving and for example, like highway driving. Could you then have an opportunity to partner with healthcare or even to encourage people? Like, what are the healthy habits that you could instill? Whether that's meditating on the way to work to put yourself in the right mindset or having a doctor's appointment. Obviously, regulations in terms of having your hands on the wheel, but are there ways to instill opportunities for health, either from a physical or a mental or emotional standpoint, that don't detract from the safety aspect in terms of technology, but that potentially provide an additional value or additional benefit longer term into the future when it's completely hands-free? There could certainly be virtual doctor's visits on your way to work or wherever you need to go. There certainly are diagnostics that are being built into homes right now, and I think that's an untapped area of potential as well. Whether it's mirrors and things that can detect your blood pressure and predict a heart attack, could there be a future where some of that is built into vehicles as well, especially for people who use it for long commutes and long drives every day?
Excellent. I think that's a beautifully provocative way to end this. Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, everyone who attended. Thank you, everyone who stuck around until the end for these questions. I believe we got through all of them, so that's great. We will be sending a recording of this to anyone who wants to reference any of these trends. And if you guys have any other questions, you can see Jennifer's email right there for any follow-ups. Thank you, everyone, for joining.
Thank you, everyone.